Most Christians, when someone challenges the historical reliability of Jesus, will often just point to the four Gospels and say, look, we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What else do we need? But the skeptic will immediately push back and say, but all those were written by followers of Jesus. They're all biased. How can we trust anything that they say? And I think this argument, this objection, has more weight than Christians often realize or want to admit. But on the flip side, I think there's something that both skeptics and Christians often ignore in this conversation, and that's the historical bedrock of Jesus' life is not the four Gospels. As much as you may have been told that at church or wherever, the historical bedrock, according to historians, is actually 8 independent sources. And those are not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's something other than that. So what I want to do in this video is break down what these 8 independent sources are, why historians trust them, both Christian and secular historians trust them as early evidence for Jesus' life, and then how you can use this next time someone tells you that the sources for Jesus' life can't be trusted. And when you see the strength of the evidence for Jesus' life, the skeptical position that Jesus never existed or that he didn't teach what he taught simply falls apart. And I'm going to show you how. So first, let's lay some groundwork that's absolutely essential before we get to the actual 8 sources. So please stick with me. First, we just have to understand that doing history is hard, especially doing ancient history. Oftentimes, the rich wrote history. It was the wealthy, the upper class, who were able to afford the leisurely time and then the materials and the education to actually write the history. And then, of course, as we've all heard, history is written by the victors. And so you have all of these biases built into ancient history that we actually have to wrestle with. And this goes back to the original complaint of the skeptic, that biases are real when doing ancient history. I have another video on why I think the gospel writers aren't biased, and so you can go watch that if you want to, but that's not what this topic is specifically about. We're asking, even if they do have biases, what can we substantiate using just standard historical means without even asking the question, are they biased or not? And we can do that with this method. Another thing that's hard to wrestle with in history is the manuscripts, the transmission of the manuscripts. So we don't have the original copies of a lot of ancient manuscript, of any ancient manuscript. They're all copies of copies of copies. Same thing for the New Testament. We don't have what we call the autographs or the original documents that were written by the New Testament authors. So how do we deal with that? And so we have all of these different issues. And so the historian has to understand, whether you're doing history regarding Jesus, regarding one of the Caesars, regarding Alexander the Great, it doesn't matter who you are studying. This is all about probability and not certainty. And I've said that in a lot of my videos, but it's worth repeating again that really nothing in life can be certain. And so you can't just give up on history and say, oh, if we can't be certain about history, then let's just not study history and let's move on with our lives. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know if the choices you make today are good or bad for you tomorrow. Everything you do is probabilistic. And so you're taking that on a leap of faith. And so it's the same way here. We are always working with the question of what is most probable based on the available evidence. That's what we're working with. Or another way to put it, what best explains the surviving data. And so this gets into sources now. Why do we need multiple independent sources? Well, think about this. If you have one source, there's 5 possibilities of that source. It could be true. So what the writer said was generally true or all true or just some form of true. Mostly true, that's fine. A little biased, but mostly true. Then you have completely invented. That would be possibility number 2 if you just have one source. The source misunderstood something that happened. They thought it happened, but they misunderstood it. They exaggerated what happened. That's number 4. Or they inherited a legend, which is similar to misunderstood, but they inherited a legend from an earlier author and they embedded it into their story, or they just recapitulated that legend. All 5 of those are within the realm of possibility if you have only one source. There's no multiple attestation. There's no multiple sources telling you, oh yeah, it actually did happen or not. And so it's just impossible to know. There's almost nothing you can do to prove or deny what that source is saying if you have nothing external corroborating that story that you know is an independent witness. Then this is where you get to the importance of independent witnesses. And I'll define independent in a second because that's the crux of this whole argument. If you have 2 documents, but you know one borrowed from the other. So one was written, say, in 100 AD and the other was written in 200 AD, and you know the document written in 200 AD actually had the document from 100 AD, that's not 2 independent sources, right? That's one source. That's one tradition because one writer is copying from another writer. That's dependent. Independent means they are different traditions. There's different streams and we can confirm this using different methods. Geographical separation. If two documents were written in different cities near the same time, it's more likely to be independent. Different interests, different vocabulary, different languages, different theological interests when we're talking about the New Testament. You can have all of these differences, but if you have the same core claim, these are completely independent streams of thought with the same core claim. When you have this, and we'll get to some analogies in a second for why this is so important, but when you have this, now the burden of proof shifts from you have to prove that it actually happened, because if you only have one manuscript, the burden of proof is on you to say, how can I prove that this actually happened? I only have one witness. I don't have multiple witnesses to this event. But if you have multiple independent witnesses, now the burden of proof shifts to, well, how do you explain those independent sources? It can't be that it was made up, because you have actual independent sources corroborating the same event, and they weren't talking with each other. They were truly independent. So how do we do that? Here's a quote from Paul Meyer, a historian, that really summarizes my point here. Many facts from antiquity rest on just one ancient source, while two or three sources in agreement generally render the facts unimpeachable. This is how important multiple independent witnesses are, or multiple independent sources. And even the Jesus Seminar, who is a very radically secular and skeptical group of the life of Jesus, highly affirm multiple attestation, this multiple independent source idea. Really, it's one of their core features when they are doing history to decide who they think the quote unquote historical Jesus is. I won't get into that, but just know that everyone across the board, from the most secular to the most religious, all agree that having multiple sources is one of the key things that a historian needs to look at in order to determine whether something actually happened or how confident we can be that something happened. And so just two brief analogies to prove this further. One, if you have one journalist reporting one thing, you may or may not believe that that thing, that event actually happened. Now, if you have two journalists in two different cities reporting the same thing, and you can confirm that, they don't know each other, they weren't reading each other, now you're more likely to believe it. Now, let's say you have Democrat and Republican reporters all reporting the same thing, the same general gist of a concept of an event. Now you're pretty much certain, yeah, this event actually happened. And this is exactly what we have in the New Testament. Multiple independent sources reporting from different locations, and even enemy attestation saying such and such happened. And so we have enemies and we have friends and followers of Jesus all reporting same basic information that we can then use to confirm the most fundamental aspects of Jesus's life. A second analogy that a lot of people use is the courtroom. If you have multiple eyewitnesses that you put up on the stand and they did not collude their stories, you're more likely to believe the event happened, even if details differ. This is really important. You do not have to believe that the Gospels agree on every detail in order to look at them as historical documents. That's a separate, more of a theological conversation to talk about, are there differences in details in the Gospels and how do we reconcile that? You don't have to reconcile that to look at the Gospels as history. That's almost like an intramural debate between Christians. As a non-Christian, you don't even have to think about that. Just ask, is it reliable as a historical testimony? And you can determine that whether or not small details differ, in the same way that in a courtroom, small details differing does not change the value of an eyewitness testimony. Lastly, I'm just going to put it on the screen. Here are some secular historians, they're not Christians, who are saying the exact same thing. Multiple independent sources is one of the most crucial pieces of evidence that a historian can have in order to get back to the truth of what actually happened or what was actually said in specific instances. So you can pause the video, look up these names, look up these books, do more research if you're a researcher and really want to dig in the details. But I'm just saying this is broadly agreed upon in historical circles. Like, this is not a debated topic, but I really wanted to give it a good overview so that there's no shallow critiques of this methodology and this concept. Now let's get to the 8 sources. What are the 8 sources, the 8 what I would call bedrock sources, the foundational sources of Jesus's life? And it's not what you think. It's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let me list them first and then I'll explain them. You have 5 what I would call gospel sources, 5 strands of tradition embedded within Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that are independent sources. You have Mark, L, meaning the unique material found in Luke, M, the unique material found in Matthew, John, as the Gospel of John as a whole, and Q. Now, let me tell you why these are the 5 gospel sources, but as a caveat, let me tell you that this detailed analysis actually proves my point. Like, scholars have been analyzing these texts for 1 or 2 centuries now with this methodology to really fine tune this to understand exactly where these strands of traditions are coming from. And so this has really stood the test of time. And so if you get confused in the weeds, I think my broader point is made that the fact that scholars have been ruminating on this for at least 100 years actually proves the solidness of these 5 independent sources, that they truly are independent. That's the whole point here, is these are independent of one another. They did not collude with their stories when they were produced. They are independent traditions, strands of traditions leading back to the life of Jesus. And so how does this work? Well, scholars are fairly certain that Mark was written first. And then when Matthew and Luke wrote their gospels, they both use Mark as a source. But interestingly enough, Matthew and Luke also have shared material that's not found in Mark, but we also know that Matthew and Luke did not use each other as sources. And so what does that mean? That means Matthew and Luke had another common source that Mark didn't use, that Matthew and Luke both used. And that source we call Q. And then scholars widely agree that John is its own independent source that did not use Mark, Q, Matthew, or Luke in its creation, and so it's its 5th independent source of the life of Jesus. These are your 5 gospel sources. And it's on the screen. You can pause if you want to follow the lines, but the arrows are just pointing to which sources influenced which other sources. And so you can fully get a handle on that on the screen. This is called the 4-source hypothesis, if you're curious. And it is the most widely held position in New Testament scholarship today, by far. Conservative theologians, liberal theologians, this is widely held, so don't think this is like some strange fringe position. It's not. Next, after these 5 gospel sources, we have Paul. Paul, he is one source. Even though he wrote a lot, he's just functioning as one source, one tradition, one strand of tradition in my count of 8. And why is Paul so important? He's important for 3 reasons. First, he says he's an eyewitness of the resurrection. And so as an eyewitness of the resurrection, he is writing his letters discussing his experience in a lot of places. And so he is telling us that he is an eyewitness to this event. Whatever you think of actually happened on the road to Damascus is one thing, but he is claiming eyewitness testimony, and that's really important. 2, related to this, is in Galatians and in other places, he affirms that he went and he met with the apostles, with Peter and James and others, and that they were all in agreement. And so just the fact that he interviewed Peter and James about their experience shows that not only is he an eyewitness to the resurrection directly, but he's also one step away from eyewitness testimony of some of the 12 who spent 3 years with Jesus. One scholar joked about it is when in Galatians, Paul says that he went and he spent, I think, 12 days, 14 days, something like that, with Peter and James. And the scholar quips, I'm sure at some point they stopped talking about the weather and they talked about other things. It's like, he spent 14 days with them. You think he's not going to interview them about their experience during the crucifixion and burial and resurrection and all of this? Of course, that's what they're talking about. That's the central message of their entire lives. So during these 14 days, Paul is certainly interviewing Peter and James, and they are agreeing on the core message of Jesus. Paul submits to them as an authority, and they're all in agreement about the gospel, about who Jesus is and what he claimed to be very, very early on. And this is in the 40s, shortly before he wrote Galatians. And then lastly, it's not just that Paul was an eyewitness of the resurrection or that he knew eyewitnesses to Jesus' life, but also that he was an enemy of Jesus. Like, he was an active persecutor of the church. He had no good reason to affirm the resurrection of Jesus. There's no evidence that he was unsatisfied with his Jewish faith. In all of his writings, he seems to have a very high view of his Jewish faith, that he was a Hebrew among Hebrews. He says that he had a high position. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. And so there's no evidence at all that he was unsatisfied with his Jewish faith. And yet for some reason, this radical shift occurs. And so even secular scholars, even though they don't affirm the resurrection of Jesus, they don't believe in Jesus, they don't follow Jesus, they don't see him as divine, anything like that, they take Paul seriously. Because Paul as evidence of Jesus's message and the message of his resurrection is so strong that no historian can ignore it. And they have to do more than just say, he made it up. So we've done 6 now. The 5 Gospels and Paul. And then there's 2 others. There are sermon summaries in the book of Acts that scholars generally agree date back to the early preaching of the apostles. And so they're basically sermon summaries of the early church kerygma. And kerygma just means the early core message of what the Christians were teaching. And it's broadly agreed that using these sermon summaries, we know exactly what the earliest apostles and Christians were teaching within 10 to 20 years of Jesus's life. And lastly, I think the most underrated of the 8 independent sources is what we call preformed traditions. The 2 examples that I'll put on the screen are 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, and Philippians 2, 6 through 11. And these are dated. So the 1 Corinthians 15 passage is dated within a few years of Jesus' death and resurrection. Philippians is dated within like 8 to 10 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. Corinthians and Philippians are Paul's letters, but what scholars agree is that Paul is quoting a preformed tradition. Philippians is an early Christ hymn that developed in the early church, and he is quoting that because his readers in Philippi actually already know this poem, and he's using it to make his point with a poem that they already know. The 1 Corinthians passage shows that it's a tradition that Paul has already received, some kind of oral tradition. And a lot of scholars do affirm that he received it when he went and met with Peter and James, as he testifies in the book of Galatians. And so you have these 2 early traditions, 1 Corinthians going back to within a few years of Jesus' life and death. And then Philippians, within 10 years, we already have a high Christology that the early Christians already believe Jesus is divine. This is not 30, 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus' death. This is right on top of the events themselves. And so you have these 8 types of independent sources. And they're already labeled independent by scholars because they have, over the years, affirmed and with a fine-tooth comb gone through all of these different sources and said, yeah, these are not coming from the same tradition. These are different strands of the tradition, which means we can go back earlier. Those are the 8 sources. Now that we know the 8 bedrock sources for understanding the historical conversation around who Jesus is, what are the aspects of Jesus' life that can be confirmed by multiple sources? And there's actually a lot. I believe I have 12 on this slide that I'm going to put up. And I'll have another video explaining the significance of each of these and how it gives us really a full picture of Jesus' life from these 12 data points about Jesus' life. But for now, I'm just going to list them. So you have baptism, the choosing of the 12 and the existence of the 12, the disciples who followed Jesus and became the apostles. Jesus dining with and treating tax collectors and sinners well, his authority over the Sabbath and over the law, his ability to exorcise demons, his healing ministry, his triumphal entry, his actions in the temple where he's flipping tables and getting whips out and he's cleansing the temple. The Last Supper narrative is another one. His trial before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, and that trial there. Then the trial before Pilate and his crucifixion and death is multiply attested. And then finally, the resurrection appearances are multiply attested in actually a lot of places. And so you may push back on a few of these, like his healing ministry. And yes, secular scholars do have alternative explanations. They say, oh, they were faith healings, that the person Jesus was so commanding that the person believed that he really could heal them. And so it was like a placebo effect and he was healed. So there's alternative explanations for what's happening there. But what no historian says is that Jesus wasn't viewed as a healer and that he didn't view himself that way. So Jesus saw himself as a healer commissioned by God to heal. It's just that historians have different ways of explaining how that belief came about. Same with the resurrection. No one denies that the disciples believed that Jesus appeared to them. The evidence is too strong that the disciples believe that. And so they have to give alternative explanations for those appearances. But they can't deny that it's multiply attested. And that's why multiple attestation is so important, as you're seeing. And so as a skeptic, if you're watching this and you're not convinced by this, the goal is not to convince you per se. The goal here is to show that all the core doctrines of who Jesus is can be substantiated with this methodology, and Christians don't have blind faith. It's not that Christians believe, despite the intellectual answer says, oh, that's just all made up. It's, no, there's really good reasons to believe that this is true. And even if you don't agree with us, at least you can see the historical rigor that goes into these kind of studies. And it's not a blind faith, but it's a researched and well thought out faith. And if you're a Christian, then I hope that this shows you that the bedrock for who Jesus is really strong. You don't just have to say, the only reason I can believe in Jesus is because I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. I believe that the Bible's perfect and gets nothing wrong. I do believe that. I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. But inerrancy of Scripture is a result of my theological beliefs, not the cause of it. And let me say that a different way. There's these historical evidences that I find extremely compelling, that Jesus did what the Bible says he did, and then he really rose from the dead. And because I believe that, then that forces me to relook at the whole New Testament and say, okay, if he rose from the dead, then I think I can make some more theological conclusions, like the Bible is trustworthy, because Jesus sees the Bible as trustworthy. And so then I get to inerrancy. I don't start with inerrancy and say the Bible's true, therefore the Bible's true. That's just circular reasoning. It goes historical rigor first, evidence for Jesus's resurrection first, and then these theological implications. It's all centered on the resurrection in my mind, at least. So that is what it means when we say that Jesus's life has 8 independent sources confirming his life, his existence, and all the major aspects of his life. I didn't go into a lot of other sources. There's other sources outside of these Christian sources, but I wanted to stick with the earliest, most trusted sources that scholars work with. I didn't talk about the Roman sources, the historians and biographers, so Suetonius and Tacitus, and even the Jewish historian Josephus. Some of that will be in the notes that I've shared, but I really wanted to stick with these core 8 sources, even though there's technically a few other sources that people would say are independent. Actually, a lot more than a few, but I feel like these are the core. And these are the earliest, most reliable, and most paid attention to sources of all of them. And so now there's 3 common objections to multiple attestation that they're popular objections. They're not really scholarly objections. Like a scholar would never make this objection because they know it's not a fair objection, but I do want to talk through them because I don't want anyone to have a misunderstanding of this methodology of multiple attestation. And so the first objection is just simply saying that, oh, but these sources could all just be sharing the same legend that spread and developed and got to, and reached them. But the whole point of independent attestation is that they are taking that category out. Independent attestation by definition excludes shared legend. And so in the process, these past 100 years of historians studying the Gospels with a fine-tooth comb is saying, what are independent traditions that aren't shared legends? And so by definition, this is ruled out. The one example you can think of is Mark and John. These have been studied to death to see that, yes, John and Mark are independent in the stories that they're sharing about who Jesus is. And so there's no shared legend there. They're independent. I wonder how many times in this video I can say independent. Somebody count, put it in the comments. And then the second objection is early Christians could have coordinated the information. And so then it all became organized and fit really nicely together because Christians were just coordinating the whole time. Like you may even say, oh, well, Paul went and saw Peter and James, so they coordinated and they got their stories straight and then they spread the gospel. The problem with that is there are still differences in the New Testament, and those weren't the only people who were writing stuff. And so you have diverse geography, language, theology, and a very short time frame. To have all these together makes it really improbable that they were actually coordinating information. Think about James and Paul for a second. You are saved by grace through faith alone, and it is not of works, but it's the grace of God, so that no one may boast. That's Paul. James then says faith without works is dead. So which is it? Is it faith without works is dead, or you are saved by faith alone, not by works? Now, I think there's a legitimate way to synthesize this theology that plays both of their theology straight. However, just like us today, there were many people that would have been confused by these doctrines in the past. And if they felt like they could have synchronized theologies and synchronized people's writings, they would have done it. It's over-exaggerated a lot in the 21st century, but the Gospels have differing details about the death and resurrection accounts. And honestly, all throughout the Gospels, there's small, tiny details everywhere that are different between Gospels. That argues against coordination. If Christians just felt like they could coordinate and get their stories straight, we wouldn't see all of these differences in details and theology. You would expect far more unanimity. And so early Christians coordinating on information simply does not best explain the data that we have. And then the last objection is that multiple attestation, or this idea of multiple independent sources, does not prove an event. It only proves that people believed an event happened. And strictly speaking, yes, that's true, but the objection is also misleading. So yes, it only proves belief. But then after that, you have to use the probabilistic explanation to say what is most probably the cause of that belief coming about. You would have to somehow explain how multiple independent communities across geographical lines, languages, interests, theological emphases would come up with the same core claim independent of one another. And that's really hard to do. That's why we say that the burden of proof has shifted to explaining some alternative reason for this belief taking place, as opposed to the simple fact that actually it's because it happened. People believed it happened because it happened. And so when you look at all the evidence and then you still want to say, oh, that's all made up, it's not real, you really have crossed the line from just being a skeptic over to being a conspiracy theorist with no evidence. And that's, I'm not trying to be harsh for anyone, but it's let's look at the data. And there are a lot of scholars who aren't Christians who are trying to look at the data critically. They're not saying this is all made up. They have their rationale and I have mine, and I think I'm right. Otherwise, I wouldn't believe what I believe. But at least they're dealing with the actual data. It's when you just throw out all of this evidence and say, it's made up, it doesn't matter. That's what's not intellectually honest at all. I'm saying that multiple independent sources does not prove with 100% certainty that something happened, but it raises the level of probability so high, and especially for the main events in Jesus' life, like I had listed earlier, that there is no good reason not to believe that those are true about Jesus. There really is not a good historical reason to doubt that those 12 things actually happened and that Jesus actually believed them about himself. And so if you're a Christian, I feel like that really should bolster your faith and say, I'm not just believing this because the Bible said so. You can probably tell I grew up in the Bible Belt because I'm tired of all the little Christianese catchphrases. So I am a Christian. I love the Bible. I just get tired of the Christianese talk from the Bible Belt. But it's not just because the Bible said so. There's real historical bedrock showing us the historical facts about Jesus. And so if you're a Christian, I hope this bolsters your faith. And if you're a skeptic and you still don't believe, that's fine. But I hope that you have a growing respect for the Christian faith and for people who really are seeking truth, because there's a lot more to the evidence for Jesus's life, death, and resurrection than a lot of skeptics are willing to admit. And so going broad a little bit, I have another video, so it's going to be probably somewhere around here is my guess, on an introduction to studying the Gospels as history. It's more broad than this. Multiple attestation is just one small section, but I don't go into near as much detail in there as I do in this video, but it gives you a more of a overview of all that you need to know in order to study the Gospels as history. And so if you're interested in that, you can go and watch that. And if this was helpful for you, and maybe you've had a conversation recently where someone has said that the sources for Jesus' life are unreliable, or you can't trust them, or you can't know who the real Jesus was, maybe share this with them and you can continue the conversation using this as a tool to help. So anyway, that's all I've got for this video. My name is Caleb Brake, and this is the Wise Fool Podcast. See you next time.